Hi, everybody. For those of you who haven't had the chance to meet, my name's Adam Carpenter. I lead growth consulting at Google Play. What I want to talk to you a bit about today is something that's very much top of mind for me, something I think about a lot. Specifically, it's how can we improve both our collective and our individual understanding about what motivates our users and use that to inform the decisions that we make to try and grow our businesses. And so kind of to start off, I want to phrase or pose one question to you. And specifically, what kind of mindset do you have when it comes to identifying and solving business problems? Do you have a fixed mindset, or do you have a growth mindset? Thinking about it a different way, are you a glass half full or a glass half empty type person? Personally, I really like to think of myself as one of the ultimate growth mindset individuals out there. I've got a pretty good faith belief that I can learn, do, and achieve just about anything. But likewise, I think that's also true for all of my teammates, all of my colleagues, and all of you out there. There's such great potential and such great opportunity to grow our businesses, to make really compelling experiences, and give players great entertainment value. And one of the important things when you think about life cycles of a game, and this comes back to kind of this notion of a fixed or growth mindset. If you think about the life cycle of a game, do you think it looks something like this? The concept that a game launches, DAU or revenue rise, they reach some tipping point, and then they begin to decline. Does that seem like an inevitable occurrence? Or does that seem like a fixed mindset? Does it seem like this should always happen? Or instead, should it potentially look like this? Think about the games that are out there. Are there games that have been able to grow steadily, month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year? I can definitely think of a few. Because even if you think as simply as what are the top games on Play right now, and which of those actually started on Facebook and successfully made the transition over, there's at least 2, 3, 4, 5 that I can think of, games that started over 10 years ago and continue to grow over time. And so to really achieve long-term sustainable growth, it really requires the right kind of focus, discipline, and particularly having a really strong growth mindset. Because at the end of the day, all games, no matter how successful they are, they do have their ups and they do have their downs. This is example data, but this is a pattern I've seen in a great many titles. Games that are growing steadily, but then something happens. Revenue begins to tip over. In this particular example, you can see there's 3 different periods where revenue declined 14%, 15%, 26%. It's almost like corrections in the stock market. But if you're a developer and you see this occurring in your game, what do you actually do? Do you think, oh, okay, the game's kind of like dying, there's not a whole lot we can do? Or do you really sit down and try to understand what's going on in your title, what's driving these changes, and what can you do to improve it? Additionally, we also see games that have tremendous declines. This, again, is example data, but it's patterned after 2 or 3 games I've looked at relatively recently. Games where over the span of about a year, revenue dropped off by almost 50%, but then I saw the teams really double down, really explore who their users were, what their motivations were, what the driving forces were, make meaningful changes to those games, and be able to actually recover and ultimately exceed the revenue they had before the major decline occurred. And so I think a lot of what is really required in order to have this growth mindset, in order to be able to overcome deficiencies and capitalize on opportunities, it's being able to ask the right questions. Pose them to yourself, pose them to your team, pose them to your colleagues, and so on. And the way that I always like to approach it is almost like from the standpoint of the 5 key journalistic questions. When you're trying to understand your users, you're trying to understand problems, really go out there, look at the data, explore what's going on, and ask who, what, when, where, why. Really try to get to the root of what's going on, because that's what's going to enable you to be able to make better decisions and improve the game features in your game. These are just some examples I threw up. These are the ones I was scribbling down as I was putting this together. But think about how you would answer who might be affected. If you see a problem in your game, think about who's being affected. Think about what might be happening to those players. Then try to understand, when did this particular problem actually begin? Where did that problem originate? And importantly, why did the players react the way they did? This type of mindset is going to help you really get to the heart of what's occurring in your game and enable you to make better decisions, both in terms of remedying deficiencies in your game, as well as prioritizing the features that you're putting into it, focusing on what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve. And so, moving on from this, I want to give you some insights that I've been able to uncover about what you can learn from launch performance and how you can take these insights, as well as questions like what I was just showing you, and make better decisions about what you should prioritize immediately post-launch. Because if you think about the launch of a game, it's arguable that the launch is kind of the most critical time during a game's life cycle. You really only get one launch. Anything else you can change, but whether it's a successful launch, a stellar launch, a failed launch, you only get one of those. And so what are the early signals that you should look for immediately after your game launches in order to make better decisions? One of the big ones that we can look at is who our golden cohort is and how long of a time window that is. For anyone who's not familiar with the concept of golden cohort, the definition I came up with is that the golden cohort is the set of players who you acquire at launch and which are likely to be the most engaged and committed players in your game. If you would have talked to me half a year ago and asked me how big the golden cohort is, how long it lasts, I probably would have said 3 months, because that had always been my initial assumption, based on metrics I'd seen in games I'd worked on in the past. But in the last quarter, I really sat down, took a look at the top games that had launched on Play in the last couple years, and what I found, the golden cohort in games is basically your first week's worth of players. The first week players, the ones you get in the first 7 days after you launch, their performance is significantly better than all of the players who will come after that. And so what I'm going to do in the next few slides is show you how that first week golden cohort compares to the players you get in the second week, the third week, and the fourth week, and how you can use the relative difference in performance to decide how to prioritize your ongoing efforts. What we're looking at here is retention for the users who installed in the first week, the second week, the third week, the fourth week. The graphs on the right-hand side, what we've done is we've taken day 2 retention for the second week cohort and divided it by the first week, the golden cohort. Then we did it for week 3 and divided by week 1, and so on. And so what you can see when you look at this chart, when you look at day 2 retention, is that the users, on average, or actually the median, who install your game and start playing in the second week are likely to have 19% lower retention than the users you get during your first week. This is a very important signal, because this is something you can actually evaluate 3 weeks after your game's launched. And if you see your retention is actually declining more than 19%, it might be an issue. And it might encourage you to ask questions around how accessible is your game? Or can you improve the first-time user experience? But really try to dig in to understand why might your user retention be dropping faster than other top games on Play. You can also use these metrics for engagement. And what we're looking at here is the amount of time players play during the first week or during the second week post-launch. And so even looking at that amount of time that a new install plays during the first week, what we see is that users who installed in the second week play 8% less time than the golden cohort does. So think about your game when you're launching it next. Is your engagement going to be an issue? Are you going to have a bigger engagement drop than 8%? And if so, is it paywalls in your game that's potentially limiting your gameplay? Or potentially, was your game designed in a way that there's a first mover advantage? The users who came in first are so far ahead that all the subsequent players feel like they can't compete and they can't keep up. Again, you can also take a look at these metrics and look at it from the standpoint of monetization, and specifically the percent of users who convert during that first week or that second week. And what we actually see when we look at new installs who convert during the first week, the week 2 installs, the median is a 30% decline from that golden cohort. Again, this is another case where you can evaluate your own performance 3 weeks into your game and understand the extent to which you're performing above or below the top games on Play, and use that to make better decisions to investigate how your title is performing. Because all of this, it's a very easy way for you to see and understand the pronounced differences between the golden cohort and all the successive weeks. Importantly, you can compare this data yourselves, and you can use this to understand the performance deltas of your users and be able to prioritize your optimizations. And what I really want to encourage you here is don't be afraid to quickly prioritize resources. If you see that your retention is doing much better than the median, if your engagement's much better than the median, but your buyer conversion's much lower, really dig in, really investigate. Ask those 5W questions and try to understand what's driving it and what should you change, improve, or add to remedy the deficiencies you're seeing in your game. So moving on from this, I want to talk a little bit about understanding buyers. And here, I'm going to give you an example about how I really kind of think about buyers and how I investigate a lot of the problems that I focus on a daily or weekly basis. And it's important to think and ask yourselves, what kind of questions are you asking about your first-time buyers? How are you trying to understand them, their motivations, their drivers? What really gets them to open up their wallets and be willing to pay for that very first time? And so there's kind of 3 metrics that you can use to look at normalized new buyer conversion. Of all of these 3, my personal favorite's the one in the middle. And what it does is it compares new buyers and divides it by installs. And what we're looking at here is not a cohort-based approach, whether it's on a day or a week or a month. We're saying, who are all the unique new buyers during that period, and then dividing them by the number of active users, number of installs during that period. The reason why I like this metric and why I like splitting it out from the cohort-based approach is it's a better way to understand the ability of a game to monetize both new users to the game as well as veteran users who've played it for a long time. Because I've seen a great many games who actually have a unique selling point that they intentionally don't try to monetize their players early on. They wait a long amount of time to get players hooked, to get them engaged, and that's when they try to monetize them. And so this is a really useful metric to understand that. And what we're looking at here is the top kind of couple hundred games on Play. But it gets a little bit more interesting when we actually start to cut it by genre. Because what you can see, I was showing you 3 data points before. There's actually a nice long trend. There's a very big distribution when you start to look at it by genre. And there's some pretty pronounced differences. So to help you understand what we're looking at here, the x-axis, this is the median first-time buyer per install ratio for each of these genres. And on the y-axis, it's the median number of installs per DAU for games in that genre. So effectively on the x-axis, it's how effective are we at converting users for the first time, and the y-axis is how much are we topping up the funnel? What % effectively of our DAU are installs? And I like to contrast the 2 major genres that we see here, MMORPGs and strategy MMO. So the MMORPG genre tend to be slightly smaller, more niche games, but much more hardcore games. So you see having an incredible ability to convert users to get them to pay, but they're doing so because they also have lower installs per DAU. MMO strategy, on the other hand, known for exceptional monetization for the users who stick around, but as much as many, many users go into those games, not that many of them actually stay. The ones who stay are very often the ones who are able and willing to pay. But even when we start to cut all of this by genre, in any given genre, all of the games are different. Each of your games out there is unique. And so it's important for you to begin to understand and ask questions about why is your game different? Why is it performing in the way it is? And like one of the things I always like to focus on is understanding why did someone pay? What motivated them to open up their wallet? Because if I can understand why a specific group of users was willing to pay, that can help me make better decisions about what features to put into the game to either get them to continue to pay or to create new features that can incent other users to pay for the very first time. And so what I'm going to walk through here is an example based on some work I did relatively recently. These are imaginary numbers, but they're emblematic of what you might find in your own game and give you an understanding of kind of how do I approach this. So I was doing some work on a game, and I was trying to understand what was driving users to buy. What was the potential there? And so the first thing I started off with is the graph that's in the upper right-hand corner. And what we're looking at here is the blue line, it's the total number of installs a game was getting in a month, and the red line, that's the number of first-time buyers that the game was getting in a month. And as I looked across this time series, there were 2 things that really jumped out at me. First was period 1. And what I was noticing is that, generally speaking, the game was having a higher number of installs, but that the number of buyers was actually declining over time. And so then I looked at phase 2, and what I jumped out here was that installs were largely steady, but there were these 2 periods where the monthly buyers was actually elevated. And so that got me curious. And one of the things I always like to do when I'm looking at data is not so much look at the absolute numbers, but try to normalize metrics, because normalized metrics allow me to view something over time and have a better understanding. So in this particular case, when I started to normalize it and I looked at new buyers per install, what I saw was that there was a very sharp spike in the number of new buyers per install in 2 different occurrences, 0.3 and 0.4. Of these, 0.4 was the most interesting because it was actually more sustained. And that got me much more curious about what had actually changed in the game, what was the feature, or what was the tweak that was done. So the next stage in terms of trying to understand this, I took a look at all of the monthly buyers, and I started cutting them by when did those users first purchase in the game? Because I wanted to get a good sense of, was the developer trying to monetize users who had been in the game for a long time? They're long-term veteran payers and players, or were they focused on monetizing users for the very first time? And what I saw is that when that change in 0.4 occurred, it increased the number of buyers across all segments. And importantly, there was a roughly equal lift in buyers, regardless of whether they paid for the first time during the game's first year, second year, third year, or fourth year. But the most compelling thing, the one that got me really engaged and really made me curious, it was seeing that there was a very significant rise in the number of users who paid for the first time during the immediate preceding year. And the question I then asked myself, what I dug into was, okay, well, are these users who just happened to install within the last year, or had they been around a long time? And what I actually found was that when the developer made this particular change, the product change they made actually created a compelling reason for their long-tenured non-payers to finally pay in the game. And I think that's an important one to evaluate whenever you're making decisions about features to potentially put in your game. Who are you focused on? Are you solely focused on creating content, creating new systems, creating new experiences just for your veteran players, the ones who've paid and played for years and years? Or are you evaluating features that you can add to improve the new user experience for your new installs, or adding new features that you can leverage to get your veteran non-payers to pay for the first time? Because this developer was able to leverage these changes and get these veteran players to pay for the first time. And so there's a real opportunity to dig in and ask questions. And so if you're thinking about doing something like this for your game, or you're thinking about what changes might you make, how might you approach solving the problems, I'll go back to what I mentioned before. Really ask yourself meaty, fundamental questions about who are you trying to impact? What are you trying to get them to do? When are you trying to get them to do it? Where would you like them to have an experience? And why are you trying to motivate your players? These are absolutely essential, because this is going to help you make better decisions and help your team function in a more collaborative and focused approach. Now, the last section, I want to talk a little bit about understanding macro trends. And kind of at the end of this, I want to challenge you to see, are there ways that you can apply this? Can you expand this and apply it in your own businesses far outside of what I'm discussing here? And so when your team thinks about the metrics that you look at, the key KPIs, what do you tend to focus on? Do you focus on leading indicators, or do you focus on lagging indicators? As an example, some of the metrics we love to talk about are revenue or DAU. Those are fundamentally lagging indicators. By the time you've seen a pronounced change in your daily active users or your total revenue, something major has already happened in your game, either good or bad. Me personally, I've always liked to focus on the leading indicators, because those are going to give me key signals well in advance of DAU or revenue changing that's going to allow me to either capitalize on an opportunity or hopefully remedy a deficiency before it has a pronounced impact on my game. And I also want you to think about a little bit, like, how often do you review your game's performance metrics? What's kind of the cadence that you review it, either individually or via analytics meetings? How do you socialize them? And have you actually spent the time to really dig into the metrics that are in your game and identify which ones should you be reviewing on a daily, a weekly, a monthly basis? Which ones are warrant ad hoc analyses? To give you a bit of an example from when I used to work on the developer side, Virtually every single morning, I would spend the first 30 to 45 minutes drinking my coffee, eating my yogurt, and looking over all of the game's metrics. I had metrics that I would look at every single day. Revenue is a great example. I'd actually look at revenue hour by hour every single day. Game economy. I always wanted to look at the sinks and sources in the game. But there were other metrics that I learned that I only needed to look at every couple days, once a week, once a month. But in building this habit, this almost like muscle memory of looking at metrics every single day at the start of the day, it helped me build up an instinctive understanding about how when metric A changes, what might be the effect on metrics B, C, D, etc. This muscle memory is extremely important because it helps me make better decisions when I see something changing or respond more intelligently when I'm asked about what a particular change or feature might do to a game. And so what I want to talk you through is a hypothetical case and get you to think a bit about if this was occurring in your game, what might you do? So in this hypothetical case, let's assume that we have a game, it's got about 1 million DAU, and they're steadily rising over time. But then all of a sudden something happens. Active users tips over. It decreases significantly. It starts trending down and down. If this was your game, how would you go about investigating this? Importantly, how soon do you think you or your company would actually notice that it had tipped over? And if it did, once you noticed it, what kind of questions would you be asking? How would you investigate it? And how quickly could you potentially identify the root cause causing this pretty significant DAU decline? And importantly, how would you be able to determine the urgency? And in doing so, what metrics would you focus on to try and figure out what that real root cause is? And so, walking through this hypothetical example, one of the ways that I might approach it is using a metric I talked about at Playtime 2 years ago, paying active users over daily active users. And what this metric does, especially when you're looking at it using a one-year time horizon, it says, every player who's active today, what % of them paid at least once during the preceding 365 days? And this is a valuable metric to understand both DAU decline and DAU growth. Because if you took a look at your game and you were trying to understand why your DAU is declining, it'd be worthwhile to see, is your POW increasing? Is it stable? Or is it declining as the DAU tips over? Because if you did take a look at it, this is what you might be able to infer. If you were seeing your POW increasing, what this would mean is that you're likely churning more non-buyers than buyers. The reason being that the numerator in the POW equation is the number of paying active users, your active payers. The denominator is your entire user base. So here, if you saw POW lifting, the denominator is falling faster than the numerator. If you saw it flat, you're likely churning both buyers and non-buyers evenly. But if you saw it declining, this is where it would get really, really concerning. And this is where you'd want to have a sense of urgency, because the chances are pretty strong that you'd actually be churning more payers than non-payers. And as everybody knows, like, payers are the lifebloods of our games. If we're losing a lot of them, it's going to make it hard to keep developing. And so this is a case where I'd really encourage you all to think about your games and really improve your understanding. Those of you who saw my talk or the article from last year, I talked a lot about top-line revenue trees, the key KPI trees. But what I really encourage you all to do is take your own games, take this concept of the tree model, take this concept of asking significant, robust questions, and build out all the key interrelations between the various metrics that are unique to your game. Because if you can proactively build out all of these relationships, you're in a much better position to evaluate changes when they occur to your own game. Additionally, having a structured approach like this also enables you to war game scenarios. To say hypothetically, what if ARPDAU was to plummet? What if buyer conversion was to rise? And you can kind of proactively build up muscle memory amongst your team about how to react to certain situations. And additionally, it will also help drive your product decisions. Because if you want to maximize the growth of a particular metric within a KPI tree, you can finally target the constituent metrics that build up to it. And so I'd really encourage you to build these out as much and as far as possible throughout your entire game. And so I kind of want to wrap up with a few final thoughts. And one of the big ones for me is that Many of you in the room either have a top 100 game or you'd really like to break into the top 100. What we see is that in order to break into this and secure this position and sustain this position, a growth mindset is really key to this. Being able to ask these critical questions, be able to evaluate the changes in your game, the features you're planning on putting into it, because every year, new games in the top 100 do exist, but it becomes effectively progressively harder and harder to break into it. And so asking the right questions, thinking about your users, understanding what's occurring, that's going to enable you to do this. And really, think about how can you apply these 5 questions. Who, what, when, where, why? Because if you can really ask these questions, answer them amongst your team, answer them by working with Google Play, your business development managers, my growth consulting team, this is how we can really help identify how. Because how is ultimately what we want. How do we design the right products to appeal to our users? How do we maximize engagement? How do we maximize fun? How do we maximize buyer conversion? Because getting to that how, getting to it the right way, that's the real way to drive sustainable business growth. Thank you very much.